The UN's top court rules Israel's decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories is unlawful. The International Court of Justice says it must end as rapidly as possible. But what's the impact of this non-binding ruling? And will it change anything on the ground? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Illegal Israeli settlements have been steadily expanding in Palestinian territories for years. Now, the UN's top court says it's time for Israel to stop, reverse course, and repair the damages. The International Court of Justice has ruled Israel's occupation is unlawful and is fueling a surge in violence. However, the court's findings are not legally binding, and the Israeli government has ignored previous decisions. So, will the ICJ's advisory opinion have any practical implications? Will it increase pressure on Israel's allies? We'll explore these issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
Please be seated.
The UN's top court has called on Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian territories as rapidly as possible. It says Israel's policies violate international law and amount to annexation.
Israel has an obligation to put an end to those unlawful acts. Israel also has an obligation to repeal all legislation and measures that create or maintain this unlawful situation.
Most Israeli settlements are in the occupied West Bank. The International Court of Justice says Israel should stop construction immediately and remove settlers from Palestinian land. It also urges Israel to pay restitution to Palestinians.
All states must now fulfill their clear obligations. No aid, no collusion, no money, no weapons, no trade, nothing with Israel.
But the court's opinion is not binding, and the Israeli government has ignored previous rulings. In a statement posted on social media, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the Jewish people cannot be occupiers in their own land.
Many of the ministers, especially from the very extreme right, believe that Israel can live without the world, and that anything which is said about us, about conquering, about occupying, and whatever, is biased.
Despite international criticism, Israel has for years seized more land to expand its illegal settlements. An estimated 780,000 Israeli settlers live in the occupied West Bank, and their Palestinian neighbors live under military rules and regulations that limit their freedoms. The initial request asking the court to review Israel's actions in the occupied territories was submitted by the UN's General Assembly in 2022, well before the war on Gaza. But the findings are now raising questions about Israel's 9-month onslaught on the Strip. Despite the ongoing attacks, Israel's strongest ally, the U.S., says the ceasefire deal with Hamas is making progress.
I believe we're inside the 10-yard line and driving toward the goal line and getting an agreement that would produce a ceasefire, get the hostages home.
It's not the first time a court has condemned Israel's policies in the occupied territories. Now, Palestinians are wondering if the court's opinion will carry any weight on the ground. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. Wesam Ahmad is the head of the Center for Applied International Law at Al-Haq, a Palestinian rights organization. He joins us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. In The Hague, Ardi Imseis is the legal counsel for the state of Palestine and author of the book, The United Nations and the Question of Palestine. And in London is Yossi Mekelberg, an associate fellow of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Wesam, let me start with you today. Palestinian officials have hailed this ICJ ruling as a watershed moment. From your perspective, do you agree? How historic is this?
Yeah, we definitely agree that this is a significant milestone in the history of the Palestinian struggle, and specifically through the use of international law as a tool for the realization of the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people. the international institutions that have developed since World War II have unfortunately been slow to address the modern day colonization that is taking place in the Palestinian context. But I think this recent decision puts in full view with strong authoritative legal content that Israel's practices within occupied Palestinian territory, whether they said it or not, reflect a continuation of colonization that needs to be brought to an end.
Wesam, despite all that, this advisory opinion is a non-binding ruling. So in light of that, will it have an impact on the ground? And if so, when might it start having an impact on the ground?
Well, the impact on the ground is very much dependent on third states and their willingness to take heed of this advisory opinion and put the recommendations brought forward to action. And this requires concrete steps to be taken by third states, by international organizations, to challenge Israel's cost-benefit calculus of this colonial project. I mean, historically, colonial projects have continued until that cost-benefit analysis changes. And right now, unfortunately, Israel continues to enjoy the impunity that comes with its unwavering support from its allies, and that requires a change within the international communities dealing with Israel and changing that cost-benefit calculus.
Ardi, we know that this isn't the first time that a court or international body has condemned Israel's policies in the occupied territories. From your vantage point, how significant is this ruling from the ICJ, and are you in any way surprised by it?
It's a seismic event when one looks at the history of the ICJ, when one looks at the history of international law and the question of Palestine. It is seismic. It offers the potential for great change if requisite follow-up is undertaken. Why? Well, as you said in your lead-up, and as Wesam has reaffirmed, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations has issued an authoritative legal opinion on Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, which it has deemed now to be and determined now to be illegal, unlawful. Now, the United Nations has over many decades indicated that many of Israel's actions in the occupied Palestinian territory have been illegal. They have documented that chapter and verse. But what they haven't done until today or until yesterday was determine the legality of the regime itself that gives rise to these other illegal actions. And that means that everything the Israelis do in the occupied Palestinian territory, because they're there unlawfully, is tainted with illegality. This has a run-on effect with not only Israel's legal obligations under international law, they're obliged to end the occupation as rapidly as possible, and based on this Bagos case, that meant 6 months. Now, in this case, the modalities of when the occupation needs to be ended will be left to the General Assembly, but we surmise that that will be listed as 6 months because that will be the starting point. In addition, there are obligations of Israel to make reparation, not only pecuniary, but also material, return of refugees, return of property, return of cultural property that has been stolen. You can imagine the extent of the damages over 60 years almost of Israeli foreign military occupation, colonization, and annexation of Palestinian territory that would entail. In addition, there are third state obligations now that are triggered. All states on earth have obligations, first, not to recognize Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, nor, most importantly, to not aid or assist in the maintenance of that illegal action. And then finally, the court has determined that Israel's presence in the territory is accompanied by a regime of racial discrimination, racial segregation, and apartheid, those terms, racial segregation and apartheid, that must be brought to an end forthwith by the international community. One thing I'd like to mention as well, Mohammed, you'd mentioned at the lead up that this is a non-binding opinion. I beg to differ. While technically advisory opinions are on their face non-binding, To the extent that the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, being the ICJ, makes a determination, authoritative determination, on how to interpret relevant international legal principles, which are themselves already binding because they form part of customary international law, those aspects of the ruling are binding. And I can tell you, hand on heart, that every key finding of the International Court of Justice, including those which I've set out now, are binding on Israel, and not just on Israel, on the whole of the international community.
Yossi, in the aftermath of the decision, we heard Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other members of his government condemn this decision. That, of course, is not a surprise that they've taken that stance. But from your vantage point, do you believe that any members of the government are taking a different stance privately? Is there any pocket of concern amongst Israeli government officials about how much pressure this might eventually put on Israel?
Yeah, it depends who you talk to in this government, because again, it's not a completely monolithic government. I think despite the strong response from Prime Minister Netanyahu or Foreign Minister Israel Katz, they understand the severity, as was so well described earlier, of this decision. Whether it's binding or not, it depends how countries actually and organizations and businesses are going to react to this. And yes, there are flaws in the ability to enforce such decision. But people like Netanyahu and some others understand the severity of this and what they imply. I think here in the UK, with a new government, which the prime minister here is a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, I expect that he will take it very seriously. I think the Foreign Secretary David Lammy visited and he talked about the need to end the occupation. On the other hand, you have elements within the Israeli government, definitely the very far right. They will only argue that whatever the international community is doing, they're doing because they hate Israel, they're anti-Semites, so one should not listen to such decision. That's what brought all of this and settler violence, for instance, to begin with. There is no recognition as such. They don't recognize, many of those from the far right don't recognize the Israeli law, let alone they don't recognize the international law. But that's for the international community to make this count. And if it's not, they will continue to do what they've done for so many years, that end with 160 settlements, 700,000 settlers, and the situation that the discrimination, the violence that we see, the confiscation of land that we see every day.
Wesam, is there going to be pressure now on Palestinian leadership to try and utilize this ruling in a way that makes a difference for Palestinians? What are the expectations going to be from Palestinians on the ground there?
Well, again, I think the advisory opinion gives us another tool in the toolkit in use for advocacy efforts by civil society. I think definitely the Palestinian leadership can leverage this opinion to enhance diplomatic engagements. It provides a strong legal foundation to make the case within the UN and various other international forums. And it is incumbent upon all Palestinians and all those struggling for the rights of the Palestinian people to make use of this decision and turn it into tangible action. We've seen what happened with the previous advisory opinion issued 20 years ago, that it had an impact in movement through civil society action, but was not utilized to the greatest extent possible. And I think we have to learn from the lessons of the past that simply having an advisory opinion, having even any judicial ruling alone will not be enough. It has to be converted into tangible action, and this will only come through concrete pressure that is being exerted through civil society that will lead to a shift in the political will of those countries that are continuing to support Israel blindly.
Ardi, I saw you reacting to what Wesam was saying, so I'm going to give you a chance to jump in. But I also want to ask you about another issue. In the past few months, we've seen the U.S., the U.K. We've seen European sanctions being imposed on Israeli settlers and settler groups that support them. Does this ruling from the ICJ mean that we might see some of these governments applying sanctions to settlers, that they might start applying sanctions to members of the Israeli government?
It's certainly possible. In fact, it would be, if you like, required. So up until now, these states who've imposed limited sanctions on individual settlers, those are sort of hiding behind a fig leaf, really. The settlements as such are actions taken by the occupying power to acquire territory through the use of force. They buttress, if you like, Israel's aggression, Israel's annexation, and the illegal occupation that it has had in the occupied Palestinian territory since 1967. So what that calls on is the duty of third states, including these states that you've mentioned, to not recognize any action that Israel takes in the territory to maintain the illegal situation, being their presence in the territory. What does this mean for settlements? Not merely the imposition of sanctions on individual settlers, one or two here or there, but to ensure that trade relations with these states that are bilateral between Israel and them, that extradition agreements that they have with Israel, if they exist, that in their bilateral relations with Israel, that they differentiate between Israel proper and the occupied Palestinian territory, which is not Israel. And this will require far more action, far more robust action domestically by these states, if they are to abide by their obligations under the advisory opinion. And I have every confidence that this is going to serve as a tool, if you like, the opinion, to change policy, bilateral policy of third states in their relations with Israel. Touches on the status of Jerusalem, touches on the status of the occupied Palestinian territory and other relations that they have, cultural relations, economic relations, and so on.
Yossi, let me get your take on this. Do you think we're going to start seeing sanctions being applied to Israeli ministers or institutions supporting the settlement enterprise? And do you think that allies of Israel could find themselves at risk of perhaps future prosecution if they support enterprises that are linked to illegal settlements?
It's definitely a possibility. There is an accumulation of events here. It's not only this. Although this case started before the war in Gaza, considering what has happened in the last 9 months, it adds to that. There is an accumulative criticism of the way Israel treats the Palestinians. Let's remind ourselves that this opinion, or the advisory opinion, is not only about what's happening in the West Bank, but also in Gaza before the war. And in this sense, that Gaza was occupied even before the war, and the fact that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, but controlled the borders, the airspace, the sea borders, amounted to in occupation. So this is kind of an ongoing, and I think, again, not much surprised us in what we heard yesterday, but it put it in a legal language, which every country would have to take very seriously, especially countries that fashion themselves in supporting human rights and want to advance international law. And this is a test for every country. How to go about it, it's different. At the end of the day, we will have to look also at the political side. No one expects all the settlements to be removed, and definitely not immediately. But it should push Israel and its allies to rethink and how they go about when there is ceasefire in Gaza, when we look at the day after, also the future of the conflict in which everyone has the same right. As the occupation comes to an end, the right of Palestinians for self-determination, the reparation, and the rest of it.
Ardi, you spoke earlier
Mohammed,
about. Yeah, well, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to get to you with a follow-up, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, just with respect to what Yossi just mentioned, he might have said this in passing, that he said no one expects that the settlers will be evacuated, or all of the settlers will be evacuated, or something to that effect. I hope I got that correctly. Actually, with respect, you're wrong, Yossi. The International Court of Justice has indicated just yesterday that every settler in the occupied Palestinian territory has to be removed by Israel from the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. Now, the questions of the modalities of when that takes place are up to the General Assembly. And as I said earlier, based on the Chagos precedent, you're looking at possibly 6 months, a determination by the General Assembly that this has to happen within 6 months. It may or may not do, but the point is it won't be up. And this is the most important point, I think, that we take away from all of this that has happened in The Hague yesterday. It won't be contingent. None of this. The end of the occupation will no longer be contingent on negotiation. The occupation itself is unlawful. It is an internationally wrongful act. And under the law of state responsibility, as affirmed by the principal judicial organ of the UN, Israel is under an obligation to end that internationally wrongful act unilaterally, unconditionally. That is not subject to negotiation. So when it comes to third states, for instance, and the pressure that they may be bringing to bear on the parties to the conflict to negotiate the end of the occupation, those days are long gone. And the ICJ has made it so just yesterday.
Wesam, I do have a question for you, but yes, Yossi, I'm going to let you go ahead and respond to what Ardi was saying.
I agree with you that, the settlements project and settlers, it's illegal. But we are in a situation that we also to look at it in a realistic way. It's not going to happen in 6 months, whether we like it or not. We definitely can look back. I said that, we wish that the settlement project would have never started. And that ends the situation that we are in. But we know that in all negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there is an agreement that some settlements will stay and some settlements will go, and there will be swap of land. So I think what I think the court decided yesterday or opined yesterday, it sets a very important benchmark about the illegality of the settlements and the presence of the settlers. How it's going to translate into political reality, which will respect, and it should respect, this decision, I think this has to be soon. It's bound to be so and take place through negotiation.
Wesam, we've spoken already in this conversation about the potential role that the UN might play going forward. The court ordered the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council to take whatever action necessary to end the illegal occupation. At the UN, what do you expect to happen? What are your expectations going forward?
Well, I mean, the UN is the composition of individual states. And so we expect those states that supported the advisory opinion in the first place to take a lead in pushing it forward through the General Assembly, but also push for Security Council action. But at the same time, not to be reliant on these UN organs themselves to take action, because each individual state has its own obligations to address its relationships with Israel, the conduct of its businesses and their engagement with Israel, especially in occupied territory and involvement of the settlement enterprise, because each individual state has a role to play in changing this cost-benefit calculus of Israel's profitable settlement enterprise. And it is this that needs to be challenged, and every state needs to reassess its relationships and how it can challenge and change that cost-benefit calculus. Because until now, Israel has developed what I call a best business practice of colonialism, which it has continued to exploit Palestinian land, natural resources, in addition to exploiting the Palestinian people themselves, whether through labor or using them as lab rats for the development of technology that is then exported abroad. All of this systemic issue needs to be addressed in a holistic manner, but each individual state has a role to play in addressing it in its constituent parts.
Ardi, why do you think it took so long for the question of Israel's legitimacy over the occupied territories to be addressed in this particular way?
It has to do with the historical record of the treatment of the occupied Palestinian territory by the United Nations since 1967. In that year, there were differences of opinion between different blocs of states as to who was to blame for the onset of hostilities and therefore the resulting occupation. The Arab states, the Eastern Bloc, said that this was an aggression by Israel. The Western states said the opposite. And there isn't a clear record within the UN system on who was to blame for 1967, despite what the record has since revealed. And so it took a while for the international community through the UN system to determine that Israel's presence in the occupied territory was in and of itself unlawful. You have some indications from the General Assembly in the late 1970s and early 1980s, very express references in General Assembly resolutions that Israel's occupation is unlawful, and as well as in the Economic and Social Council in the 1990s. But those references to Israel's illegal occupation drop off after Oslo. And I have not been able to determine why. I surmise that it's because of the promise that Oslo held out to the international community on the end of the occupation. And we now know that that was a false promise. But all this to say, it took a while and a lot of work to get the court to arrive at this conclusion. But it fundamentally was determined by the facts on the ground, all of which are established in the UN record, overwhelmingly clear. Annexation of occupied Palestinian territory and the desire to frustrate the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination while imposing a regime of racial segregation and apartheid on them, that renders the occupation existentially unlawful.
Yossi, we only have about a minute and a half left, but I just want to ask you, Israel immediately, government officials in Israel immediately rejected this conclusion from the ICJ. Do you think that the opinions that have been stated by Netanyahu and other ministers and members of his government reflect what public opinion is in Israel?
No, and we know that Israelis would like to see a different government. Since October 7, we saw that opinion polls after opinion poll, Israelis want to see the end of Netanyahu premiership. But it doesn't mean that the Israeli society is going to the left or becoming more peaceniks as a result of it. And I think possibly this advisory opinion came in different timing, and not during war, and not a society that suffers from trauma. Maybe there would be more openness towards that. Right now, I'm afraid that most Israeli will see it again as an act against Israel, in sense to going through what Israel needs to go in Israeli society. So honest, soul-searching thing, what has the occupation done to Israel, to its democracy, to its morality, to its relations with the Palestinians and the region. But I'm afraid on this issue, it's not going to happen right now.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there today. Thanks so much to our guests, Wesam, Ahmad, Ardi Imseis, and Yossi Mekelberg. And thanks so much for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.